Thank you for sticking with us this far into Seeing Sound. If you're anything like me, you're probably quite tired by now. I almost watched all the overnight international stuff. I didn't quite make it, but it was amazing, I have to say. And if you didn't get to see it all, do catch up with it all. It will all be there forever, as far as I know, apart from the Hong Kong programs that are only on until the end of the week. So check those out. Welcome to the New Histories panel. It's maybe a bit of a silly name, New Histories. I've been thinking about it and thinking, can histories be new? And then thinking maybe all histories are new, like we actually do reinvent history all the time. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much because I do talk too much in these things. But yeah, the theme of this is obviously the history of visual music. Seeing Sound is a practice-led symposium, really. It's primarily aimed at makers and audiences of new visual music, I would say. But we've always been interested in the history too. I think actually anyone making new visual music really should be aware of this history. And also a lot of our kind of precursors in this world. A lot of the work is amazing as well. I still think Oscar Fischinger can't be topped in terms of visual music and many other of our kind of predecessors in this field. Anyway, I said I wouldn't talk too much, so I'm going to try not to. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists. They will then introduce themselves in more detail and with some kind of provocations for the conversation. Then we're going to move on to a panel discussion, and then we'll open it out to Q&A from primarily from the chat. It may not be quite as cut and dried as that. We might feed things in earlier than that. So yeah, start getting questions in whenever you like, and we'll get to them. So yeah, without further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to this panel. We've got Maura McDonnell, who I've known probably for 20 years, I think, Maura. Yeah. And I see as a real key person in the visual music world, a real sort of enthusiast. She's always writing about it, blogging about it. She's one of those kind of key people that keeps this world going, I think. She's written some great stuff about visual music. And I know something that most of you don't, in that I've read her PhD thesis. She recently successfully completed her PhD, and it's amazing. And I really hope it will be published soon. There's some incredible work in there on the history of visual music. Chris King runs the Video Circuits group, now on Facebook, previously in various other incarnations. And again, a real key person, particularly around analog video technology and its use in visual music and other kind of mediums. It's been a real sort of success story, that, Chris, hasn't it? It's that whole world has become so popular with younger artists at the same time as many of the original people are still going. And that's kind of amazing to see that historical kind of lineage. Trent Kim, again, has a kind of real expertise within this world around Lumia and the art of light. If you didn't catch his talk earlier this afternoon, it is again archived on YouTube, and do look back at it. It's fantastic and amazing work preserving and rethinking that history. And last and absolutely certainly not least, I'm very delighted to welcome Cindy Kiefer, Director of the Center for Visual Music in Los Angeles. Of course, a real key person in this world. And you may not know this, Cindy, but you're a kind of key person in Seeing Sound, really. The first event was very much kind of on your advice and your guidance, really, and some conversations that we had. And particularly that involved the inclusion of a fantastic program of Mary Ellen Bute films. And I really have to repeat this from time to time. That's where we got the name from. Seeing Sound is a name that we stole from Mary Ellen Bute. She puts it at the beginning of a lot of her films. And I remember when we had the first Seeing Sound and I didn't know it was only the first, you know, it might have just been a one-off event. I thought, well, that'd be a good name for it. And it's stuck. We were delighted to welcome Cindy to the second event as well, as a keynote speaker. And yeah, you've given me a lot of guidance and things to think about over the years, particularly in terms of this historical component to this field. So yeah, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Maura, who's going to present first.
Thanks very much, Joe. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay and it's all working. Yeah. Great. Okay, well, thanks so much for including me in this panel and for this amazing event and the papers. And even though it was online, it was very enriching and very meaningful, which I wasn't expecting, to be honest, but it was really, really lovely to look at this online. So thanks, Joe, and for all the Seeing Sound symposiums over the years. So I have prepared just a short talk on the question of history and the visual music history, according to Joe's advice about this panel. So what I'd like to do is just kind of run through some of my ideas, what I was thinking about, or what I think about in terms of visual music history and how I approach it. So I'd like to just really basically tell you how I came to a visual music practice and named it as such. That's one thing. And then I'd also like to tell you about what I wanted to look at in the past as part of my activity as a visual music artist, researcher and a teacher, and to look at history, as it were, I suppose, and what was I looking for in that past? And I seem to be a little bit obsessed with looking at that past, you know, initially, and hopefully when I go through this short presentation, you'll probably understand where I might have been coming from. So I'm hoping that this overview then of my approaches and my coming to a visual music history might throw some light on why I think the term visual music is a very significant term, both in its usage in the past and its practice in the past with other terms, and it's also its usage today. And I'm also hoping that it will also throw light on my desire to work with the general idea and term of visual music. And perhaps I'm very interested in not pinpointing the term too much as being a very specific type of art activity with a very specific type of meaning, and the reasons I wish for this to be open. So I conceive maybe the term as being an open-ended term, moving from the past to the present to the future in various forms of practices, analysis, technologies, and disciplines. And I also see it as being a revisiting. There's something we have to keep coming to revisit history, revisit our own practice, and come to understand what was done and what people are doing and why they want to do it. So I had two starting points for looking at a visual music history. One, I'm looking at history from an artist standpoint, an artist who herself is involved in creating visual music art and a bit obsessed with that, I have to say. And I also like to name it as such. So therefore I am an artist that has this impulse. I want to create visual music work. I also am looking at another artist's work, be it a contemporary artist's work or someone from the past, in order to draw out significances for a visual music practice. So I kind of have an aim. I'm not really looking at it for just to talk about it. I actually want, what are the significance for a practice? And I do this in a number of ways. And one way I might start with the question, what was the visual music that the artist was creating and exploring? So I discovered through various extensive research cycles that even when an artist looks to the past, they're actually looking for the insights and those impulses in the artist or the artwork examined, and sometimes in the significance of an event or a technology or a gathering of collaborative artists. And the concern then is to draw out these insights and the motivations of the artist by either maybe looking at their work anew from the present artist's eyes, or maybe examining the writings by the artists themselves, which is always really fascinating, that they have left behind. And of course, I would have that particular line of inquiry: where is the visual music impulse? Where is it in the work or in the thinking or in the processes? So I think anyone could do this. It's something we all could do. Sometimes the evidence is in the work itself, and we're all going to bring our own processes to this. But it's like I want to see and hear it, I want to read about it, and I want to know. And I'm not really looking for a chronology of events or dates. Even though I did study history for time at school, or in college, I actually found that part quite hard. But what I might write to look in the historical account is, I'm not really either looking at trying to define what is a good visual music work. It's rather, I want to find anew the discoveries that these artists found or explored or brought forward in their art and in the artworks themselves. In other words, I want to try and discover the visual music impulse. operating in some artists' works of the past and artists' works of the present. And that's probably my main preoccupation. And it's an impulse that to create work as an impulse to find out what were other people's impulses. So I did do this. And as Joe said, I did actually spend quite a lot of time thinking about this for the last 20 years. And when I did make some discoveries, because when I did look for these impulses in history, I actually came up with what I considered quite exciting discoveries. And I was not expecting this, but when I looked deeper in artists' writings or their works or a critic's writings or commentators' writings, I started to recognize resonances in their works with the kind of problems they wanted to solve, what way they conceived what they were doing, with actually resonances in my own practice. I was not expecting that. So what I've come and continue to come to know in my practice in general, my concerns and the problems I try to solve in my work, I was rather surprised to find, hey, this person was trying to do that. They were trying to solve that problem. I totally get what they were doing there. Even though we might have different ways of doing it, there was something resonated. So in my experience of work with history, discoveries can be made because they resonate with something I've already explored in my own work. And that's what I call the artist's perspective. And it's also something maybe I've experienced in coming across some other person's work, contemporary practice, or even contemporary writings, or presentations and installations, and I haven't been able to articulate them. So sometimes when you look at these works and these unexpected discoveries emerge, it's kind of, for me, it's quite joyful. So I made many discoveries because of this, what I call the artist resonance factor. So I kind of like to kind of celebrate that I really would conceive that artists should look at history, should examine it in their own way from their own motives and impulses, and try and identify those impulses in the past. And we all would like to read those. So what is history then? My conception of history is that it's a living thing. What is alive now was alive before. So I'm interested in what are our connections, our similarities, and our differences. And I'm interested in history as a present continuous flow, like an evolving tapestry. And it's not a solid fact or an entity or a thing, but by keeping this as a present continuous flow, it allows freedom of insight to emerge, or for significance in a work to have room to emerge anew. And I like that idea of giving it room to come into this new thinking in the present moment. So another aspect of that freedom is that every time you go back and look at history, you learn and uncover something new. And even though I would have looked at works over the last 20 years, every time I go back and look closer, I would find something else, which was always surprising. So I've kind of had to say, I'm going to stop for a while now because I keep finding new things. So we're doing history now. There's new forms emerging, there's new hybrids, new inquiries, new possibilities afforded by the new technologies and the new aesthetic spaces and experiences. And a lot of the people on this symposium have actually been bringing this to our attention in the most amazing way. But it's okay also, I think, to stay with one technology and means of working if this resonates with your own artistic impulse and compels you to create the artwork, just as much as it's okay to go into these new territories. I'm very aware that I actually still work with the same methods and process I've been using for 20 years. And someone mentioned that in one of the Q&As, that they sometimes felt like something gets stuck there. I feel I might have got stuck there, but I might change to another technology, but I have the same approach. So that was kind of interesting in my research as well. So I'm interested in this history of visual music as a living history. I like to look at history as a living present. We stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before, but some of those shoulders may have got forgotten or overlooked. So that's why I think we keep it to revisiting history. I'm interested then in recording to history of visual music some of the impulses and significance in history for a visual music practice today. And so I'm primarily interested then in identifying and examining the works of artists and inventors who sought to realize their artistic impulse, especially in bringing music and visual art together over time and in time. So it's like the history of visual music, like evolving trajectories of people's lives and interests and reasons for creating work. I do therefore believe it is okay for artists to come to history and to write about the history that pertains to their art, practice, and use that unique artist impulse that they have themselves and that artistic resonance factor to draw out the insights for us readers. The toing and froing then between the recognition and the resonance in the works of the past to the works of the present is a really amazing thing. And it was also drawn to my attention that in an important aspect of history, a philosopher, Dilthey, said this, and I'm not a philosopher, but the person who said this to me is a philosopher: the person who writes history creates history. And that's a rather sobering thought. But I want to be part of writing the visual music history, and I'd also urge other artists to excavate and examine the history that is relevant to their interests and practice, so we can all create this history together of what's happening now and leave behind the writing for other people to read and people in the present moment. So just a tiny bit on my own history. I had what could be called my own art moment between 1996 and 1998, where I intensely worked with electroacoustic music composition and video experiments into integrated artworks without any history or prior knowledge of working with these forms. So my starting point was, I didn't know what to call it, but I knew it was there. It was here, it was rich, it was physical, it was aesthetic, it was me, I was doing it. I was very convinced by it, but it wasn't not just a theory or an experiment or having some fun, which was said to me at one point with technology, but the start of a lifelong practice, and it was a profound discovery for me. But it was also a very lonely moment because I didn't know anything of its history. So even though I studied everything to do with new music, Perez, Stockhausen, Kaya, Sarajevo, Barry Truax, noises, sounds, edited sounds, timbres, crafted my own sounds, a composition I call Split that explored the movement between melody and sound, and this parametric control of timbre. These are very exciting things for me, the music technology field. And this opened the door for me as a way to look at the visual realm. So perhaps I thought if there can be micro motions in sound, that there can be micro motions in visual. If the sound can be layered and edited, therefore visuals could be layered and edited. And so my lifelong quest began. So if sound consisted of grains, then such grains could be arranged to create harmonic or dissonant material. So images could have similar properties, harmonic geometries, chaotic forms, textures. It was quite intense, but when I did lift my head a little to write my master's thesis on analysis of harmony in an audiovisual work, I slowly started to realize that this practice was a thing, but it was hard to find out where or who did it before. But I did discover contemporary artists such as Joran Rudy, Dennis Miller, Jean Piche, and Joseph Hyde, whom I met in Belfast in Queens in 1999, I think it was. And then I started to discover their work and was fascinated by that, but also the history. And it also was greatly enhanced by the fact I discovered Fred Colopy's Rhythmic Light website and the writings of the amazing William Moritz. So these were the sort of starting points for me to get into the history. So my motivation in looking at history was because I was so shocked that there actually was a history for something that I had wanted to do and had an impulse to do. I had this interest in working with moving image and music work long before I had the means to do it. And I stumbled upon the means, you could nearly say, through music technology. So as I said, I had the interest and I had the desire, but for me, there was no history. And I suppose that's been my kind of impetus. Visual music then is like facilitated by this artistic quest and the artist's desire perhaps to express and generate forms of art with their possible means and their possible pieces of knowledge that they have. So that's really the provocation, I suppose, that I'd like to bring to the discussion about a visual music history.
Brilliant, thank you, Maura. You've given us so much to think about there. We could easily base the whole of the rest of the panel just on that. But there's a couple of things I'll just quickly draw out that I think would be particularly interesting to talk about. One is your motivation for uncovering this history as a maker. And I think lots of people might recognize that at Seeing Sound, and I certainly do. And anyone who doesn't, who is making this stuff and isn't looking at the history, should, not for like sort of moral or historical reasons, but just it will really feed what you do. Yeah. I think there was another one, but I can't remember what it was. So I'm going to pass over to Chris now. Chris, yeah, go ahead.
Hello, I'm going to try and keep it very brief. I'm just going to share my screen. So here we go. So yeah, my name's Chris King, and I was very lucky to attend Seeing Sound in 2016. And I did a talk about some of the research I'd done on British artists using video synthesis, which I think we've discussed, or some other people have discussed in presentations, as like a small subset of some visual music stuff. And I originally studied drawing, and while I was studying drawing, and also before I'd begun studying drawing at Camberwell, I'd always made electronics, and I started to wonder why there weren't visual musical instruments, and that kind of started me off on this exploration. And it's very much something that I do and have done. It kind of started as I was graduating, and then although I'd been aware of some experimental audiovisual stuff, I started this blog called Video Circuits, and at the same time there were a few other people, and it's writing other blogs. So there was an artist called Sabrina and an artist called Jennifer Stratford, who both had blogs that were kind of about the history of video art and visual music. And especially these abstract audio-visual pieces in video art that kind of relate very strongly to visual music. And so talking to people, and it sounds ridiculous, but even in 2009, which is well into like Web 2.0, there were some things that were much harder to find online. So it was also a process of, I collect kind of exhibition documentation from old exhibitions, so like catalogs and early video art magazines and these types of things, to find references and links and kind of get a bit obsessive about it. And so that's how Video Circuit started. And it was very, very expansive because I'm interested in all sorts of different things. So like alphabets, notation, kind of, and it's very, very material focused. But so I started writing this blog, and that kind of developed a community of people who I would converse with and talk about this stuff, which is, again, really goes into what Maura was talking about, which is kind of feeling like there should be this stuff out there and then going and finding it. And because the internet was really becoming a much more powerful tool in terms of being able to find all of this stuff, and was being used also much more ubiquitously, it was easier to find. And it was also easy to find the people who hadn't been well documented, or maybe were doing things in a vernacular way that wasn't academic or institutionally supported, which is something else I feel really strongly about and really interested in, kind of visual music practice that happens, that crosses over between those two zones. So then now Video Circuits, a little bit after I started writing the blog, which kind of tapered off, became this Facebook group where I would hunt down early video art practitioners and basically stalk them, which is very problematic. But it turns out if you email people really nicely, or you just ask them, message them on social media, often they weren't there to talk about video art. They maybe didn't make video art anymore. They would answer your questions, and then they would come and talk to younger, newer artists. So this really big community, which I share a lot of content to, kind of built up around that. And at the same time, I was also giving talks and demonstrations about various different people's techniques and the kind of material practice. And the group also brought lots of people together who were doing similar things in different parts of the world. So as well as bringing people together who maybe were working in the 60s and 70s with people that were working now, and people that were still working now who had started working in the 60s and 70s, so some of the pioneers, it was also bringing people together from different countries, or even from the same city who didn't know about each other, who would then maybe go on to talk about their ideas and just, you know, like be able to have someone to bounce ideas off and collaborate with. We're doing something that has this massively deep and incredibly interesting history, but that is quite hard to find the right search terms or language, especially if maybe you have started it from a very sort of personal, individual place, and then you want to plug into this deeper history. You need to get some of that language and those search terms. And it's really nice to have this community to be able to do that. And Facebook is a very problematic platform, but the reason it's there is because lots of the practitioners would have it for other social reasons, especially when we were less critical about these things. But even now, there are lots of people on there who you can't find anywhere else. They don't have a website. They maybe stopped making work 20 years ago, but they've still got all of their tapes or films or some of their works, or they can talk about some of the things they did. Some of them don't appear in any histories, or only appear in a few histories, because I think it's really important to think about this idea of histories, because there's so many amazing books, but that are kind of siloed, or histories that are written about a specific practitioner or a specific movement. And actually there are so many resonances between all these things. And so then I don't need to talk too much about Vector Hack, which you can see is at the banner at the top of the screenshot of Video Circuits, but I was just going to finish by talking a little tiny bit about Vector Hack, which Derek has already very wonderfully covered. And so attending things like Seeing Sound, which is this brilliant practice-based and interdisciplinary symposium that kind of allows practitioners who aren't maybe working within institutions and practitioners that are to meet each other. That was incredibly influential, and some other events I also attended. And Derek and Ivan, who conceived of Vector Hack, I think met through Video Circuits. And I don't want to completely claim that that's the only reason they had met each other, because I think they were also working in many of the same networks. They asked me to be involved in putting on the festival in 2018, and we came up with kind of a program and helped sort of like work out how we were going to structure it. And it's this very community-based festival that's based all around oscilloscopes, lasers, plotters, and anything that outputs to physical vector-based displays. So that's one thing that really sets it apart. And as Derek was saying, allows us to focus down. But then within that, there's all of this kind of communities, online communities, communities of practice and histories to tap into. So we had like practical workshops where we're teaching people how to build things. We have historical talks where some of the artists and historians that have spoken at Seeing Sound also presented, but loads of other people that you might not ever find anywhere else. Zagreb and Slovenia have this amazingly deep history where we put on the festival, have this amazingly deep history of computer art and video art. So we tap into that. So people like Darko Fritz, who's a curator, who's an expert on the new tendencies movement, spoke. And it's this kind of plugging in of the new kind of electronics practice, some of which is academic, some of which is vernacular, but all these people kind of working on similar things, but just with different sets of languages and different kind of reference points, but doing similar things are brought together and plugged into this really deep history. And it's really hard work, but you have to, you know, go and get these people and tell them about each other and then get them interested in each other and talking. But so instead of showing lots of the amazing footage that Derek showed, I just wanted to show a few slides with lots of pictures of people doing things together and presenting things to kind of make that point. And I think that Seeing Sound is just the same kind of experience. And I wanted to sort of also say that I think this is really important work that brings those things together. So that's where I wanted to finish.
Fantastic, Chris, thank you. Again, I'll keep things moving, but there's just a couple of things I want to draw out. One, just to respond to what you just said and acknowledge the debt back, really. I super enjoyed Vector Hack this year online. I mean, I enjoyed the first one as well. But one thing I wanted to say was just, it was quite an inspiration for this event, actually, in that I'd attended a number of academic conferences online this year and kind of thought, oh, I don't want to do online conferences. They're just boring and it doesn't work. And Vector Hack really did work. I thought it seemed lively and, you know, engaging. And I've definitely pinched a few ideas from you as to how to do that and how to present work in that way. So thank you.
I'd like to take credit for those ideas, but
sure.
Yeah, I definitely worked hard. It was a lot of work, but Ivan and Derek, yeah, we absolutely smashed it, I think. And yeah, but it almost killed us, I think, in the process.
Well, I slightly know the feeling.
We were very scared about moving online from physical.
Yes, well, it is. I mean, that's a whole other topic we could talk about, isn't it? And we probably shouldn't, but it is exhausting, isn't it? It's weird. I don't know why. And yeah, the other thing I wanted to draw out was just, again, might feed discussion later, is the way video circuits inhabits Facebook, I suppose. And I find that interesting, and maybe with reference to Maura's blog as well, that I think we need to acknowledge that not all historical sources are books now or articles, and that things like Facebook groups and blogs can be important. But I suppose the other thing to feed in is to point out that not everything is on the internet as well, which everyone on this panel knows. But it's always worth reminding ourselves that a lot of this history, you still have to go and find it somewhere in somebody's garage or workshop or, you know, archive. Anyway, I'm going to move on. Next, I'm going to look to you, Trent. Something I should have said right at the beginning. I think it was probably me. Somebody has somehow managed to use an old biography of Trent on this panel's page. Trent, have you been to Seeing Sounds before, or is it?
Yeah, this is my third.
Yeah. So we
somehow
ended up with one of the old ones, but Chris pasted the up-to-date one in on the chat, and I'm really sorry about that, Trent. Over to you.
Thank you. And can you see this okay? Yep. Okay.
Yep.
I'm just going to move this screen. There we go. Hello, my name is Trent Kim, and I'm an artist, primarily using the medium of light. And I've worked as a lighting designer in VR, video artist, projection artist, and Lumi artist. I'm trying to be. I mostly produce live time-based works, and I've greatly benefited from the freedom given by the idea of animation and performance. But it was Lumia that really helped me find my own territory. So at the moment, I'm pursuing my PhD. I'm in my final year writing up at Royal College of Art in animation program to discover the alternative histories of Lumia that are primarily concerned with contemporary practices. I'm most interested in the relationship between historical reading and writing and making. And hopefully I can contribute to today's discussion from this angle. Until I fully immersed into my archival and historical works, I didn't realize that how provocative it seems for makers to undertake historical reading and writing, and how it was actually very difficult for me to learn to own this idea of maker's bias when it comes to reading and writing and historical topics. I've learned how political and uncollaborative territories are of other art forms, and through working in conventional theater and audiovisual performances and installation art, I really struggled to locate my practice until I discovered this idea of the art of light. However, prior to that, I had made various attempts, and I wanted to share some of the examples to show you my journey. And for instance, in a more conventional art music performance, which I worked on in 2009, I rejected mapping or associations between audio and visual, and I used my body as a perceptual agent of experiencing. So I've collected, so I've used the notational experiment to perhaps like almost auto draw in response to the musical movement. As you can see from, there are 12 different movements in this particular piece. And also I noted some adjectives and nouns to document my impressions. I made diagrams to capture the experience motions, and as well as spatial configurations, and even measured my heart rate, which I actually used in one of the performances by using one of the audience, the real-time tracking of the person's heart rate. The photos on the right are from the actual performance that show how I then reinterpreted my notation into forms of light. Despite my poetic approach to this collaboration, I felt that I was still an invited guest and perhaps a parasite to this musical space. In my other projects, I had a very similar experiences. And this is where I moved on to more solo works and installation works. And this was quite interesting one from 2013. And in this art exhibition, particularly this work, I needed a new territory independent from other genres within fine art, including video art and kinetic art, where my previous works evidently were categorized because I used camera and video projector and physicalized to materialize my idea of light. To claim a new territory of light, first I tried to eliminate the idea of image to avoid any potential interferences. And I reimagined our eyelids as a biological filter to help us extract the experience of light. So this one, the visitors were invited to this experience. They would place their the phones over their head and experience the light composition differently. So in my current practice-based historical research on Lumia, upon archival surveys, I began experimenting with reproducing similar image as Phantaclavulux shows. Then I began practicing how to animate and perform live with my bare hands. And so that's the live captured on the right, and Lumina Fold. And then began critically examining and reflecting on my own artifacts to establish a rather biased history of Lumia that matters to the contemporary practitioners of Lumia, like myself, where my research can propose historicity, materiality, aesthetics, and structures Lumia in much more harmony. I'm arguing the irreducibility of having a bias, and yet how it is necessary to allow the practitioner's bias in historical reading and writing. from a perspective of now. So as I presented at the initial provocation, new histories cannot be unbiased, while other histories are required to remain political concerning their own. So then the practitioners of each creative community must play a critical role in historical writing and should be allowed to reflect and advance with their own the practical bias. So this is how I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. You sort of summarized yourself there, really, with the this idea of bias and how it's impossible to get away from it. I think that's very interesting and something we could talk about later. The only other thing I'd like to distill from there is just this idea of you feeling like an outsider and having to find this kind of place, which I think many of us recognize, really. And I think it's very, something I might want to feed in later is just talking about the term visual music. Because of course there are plenty of people doing this kind of work who don't use that term, but I think it's great because it actually identifies a thing. It's not just audio stuff and visual stuff stuck together, but it's a discipline, and I guess Lumia is too.
Yeah, definitely.
Over to you, Cindy.
Good morning from California. Thank you, Joe. Thanks to everyone at BathSpa who's working on this event and everyone that you've brought in. Huge thanks to Center for Visual Music's members, donors, trustees, councils, and all of you who support our work. We've been pleased to host both Joe and Trent at Center for Visual Music to research in the archives. I'm gonna share the screen. I have a presentation about Center for Visual Music, who we are, what we do to provide access to the largest, what we believe is the world's largest collection of visual music resources. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to whip through because I think my presentation is too long. Very quickly, Center for Visual Music in California was founded in 2003. You may recognize the names of some of our founders: Barbara Fischinger, who is Oscar's daughter, John Whitney Jr., Jules Engel, Jordan Belson, William Moritz, also David LeBrun, John Kanemaker, and myself. About me, very quickly, I have a degree in film from New York University. I have in a previous life, I produced and directed music videos. I also worked as a research assistant for William Moritz, the animation historian who devoted over 30 years to researching visual music. I worked with Jordan Belson over the course of 12 years and produced his last film, as well as his DVD and video projects. And okay, let's whip through this quickly now. Hello. Okay, this one is for Joe and for the conference. Here is a Seeing Sound flyer from our archives in the late 1940s. We distribute a program of Mary Ellen Bute's film works called Seeing Sound, which I believe I slightly suggested very strongly to Joe that he book for the very first Seeing Sound, hence the name. We still do send out that program called Seeing Sound. Sorry, I forgot to start my timer. Mary Ellen Bute is just one of the film artists whose work we do distribute. What do? Center for Visual Music, nonprofit. We have an enormous amount of film, video, and digital media collections, special collections, paper files, clippings, articles, documentation. We have artwork, including a wonderful Fischinger collection and others, posters, ceramics, books, monographs, dissertations, periodicals. At last count, 5,000 or 6,000 books, I think. I'd have to check that. Still photography, slides, digital stock stills, including the photo archive of Hy Hirsch. Papers and films of Oscar Fischinger, plus many animation drawings and photographs, and the original research collection of Dr. William Moritz, spanning 30 years. Other collections, including the collection of Elfrida Fischinger, who collected everything to do with Oscar Fischinger screenings and avant-garde screenings in Los Angeles for many decades. That's about 6 decades of the history of avant-garde and experimental film in Los Angeles. Glenn McKay and other collections. And this one was for Chris, state-of-the-art video display in 1985 in the UK in a small gallery in Cambridge. This is a Fischinger film Chrysa being shown in the gallery from 3/4-inch U-matic videotape. And one wonderful thing about all the slides in the archives is we do have the history of how visual music has been exhibited in galleries over the past, well, since the 1920s, actually. Access to the collections. What do we do with all this? How do we provide access? Well, we can only provide access to a certain portion of it because we're in America where arts aren't really funded. So here's what we do. In symposia, lectures, presentations, appointments. Well, formerly it was on site for researchers. Because of COVID, that is all on hold. Many research would come for access to original materials, and now it is just digital provision of stills, research, etc. Online library and resources, which we're constantly updating. That's a major project for next year. Loans to museums, archives, schools, festivals, etc. Publications such as the recent Fishinger book, travel and curated programs, museum installations and exhibitions, social media spotlights on items and films from the collections, DVD releases, limited video on demand. Film preservation is a core part of our mission. This is old-fashioned film preservation from the original film materials, photochemical preservation to make new preservation negatives that will last over 100 years if properly stored at the correct temperature and humidity in our cold vaults. Then there is digitization, sometimes further digital restoration, but with everything, we create new negatives that will last for many generations. Just a few of the films we've preserved: Fishinger Study 7, Jordan Belson's Mandala, lower left, Jules Engel's Playpen, lower right, Charles Dockham, 1952 performance at the Guggenheim. One thing I should mention is Center for Visual Music is not just a film archive. We're interested in the entire body of a filmmaker's work, which is why we have art, ceramics, photography, writing, papers, and many more materials. Film loans and licensing from CVM to a great amount of places, and I put the UK ones first. Many of you have seen some of this shows. Also, then comes New York, then comes Paris, Germany. We have 11 films right now in Seoul, in a special visual music wing and an exhibition in person, in real life, until the end of the year. Other exhibitions, many other museums worldwide, many festivals. And these are not all Fishinger films. Some of these are contemporary works that we send out in contemporary programs. However, Fishinger and Bute and Belson are the most requested films from the archive, of course. And this is to tie in, as everything ties in, all our history ties in with all of the panels here. This is to tie into one of the panels yesterday with the discussion of the concept of Music of the Spheres. We recently restored the film Music of the Spheres by Jordan Belson, which was showing at the Camden Arts Center till everything closed down. So perhaps it will show soon again in Camden, in London. And here's the first, what we believe is the first use in English of the phrase visual music to refer to a film. 1935 on the left, this is a promotional flyer for Mary Ellen Bute's films. And on the right, here's another promotional flyer, an excerpt from it, What is Seeing Sound? Now, of course, visual music, that term was used by a critic, Roger Fry, about a painting earlier, but in film, this is the first we can find in English about referring to a film. And if anyone can find something earlier, we'd love to know about that. Bute, we have concept paintings by Mary Ellen Bute for Spook Sport, which have not been shown, strangely enough. They are very, very fragile, however. Bute did make a number of concept paintings for this film, then hired Norman McLaren to animate them. One of the unfortunate parts about rewriting visual music history today is that people are giving Norman McLaren credit for directing this film, which is false. It is a film directed by her. We do have the proof. There are letters also in the Bute collection at Yale with her little storyboards and with some drawings to Norman McLaren asking him to execute her ideas. So this is one thing we need to watch out. As someone, Chris, who said, the person who writes history creates history, I believe Morris said that. Unfortunately, not everyone's writing correct history today, obviously. So I just want to stand up for giving correct credit to Mary Ellen Bute and not to men around her that she hired and worked with. This is one thing we're very important problem. Oscar Fishinger, the largest collection, and you knew I was going to talk about him today. Made over 50 films, 800 paintings, father of visual music. Going back, I've pulled a few more UK things. Going back to 1933, clipping from the Film Society in London, where he showed some experiments, some hand-drawn sound by Oscar Fishinger. Of course, he started these experiments a few years earlier. Here's some night scans of one of the nitrate in our collection. On the edges of the nitrate film, you can see some of the patterns that he actually did shoot onto the film's optical sound area. He called these ornaments. Hence, since that time, they were called the ornament sound experiments. Early 30s, This is the surviving nitrate 35mm optical track positive element that he created. This is for preservation. This is a bitch. You can see some frame lines here. When will you hear those bumps in those frame lines, of course. And oddly enough, in film restoration, that's called waterboarding. Anyway, I'm going to move on from this. Okay, here is some unshot ornament sound experiments created by Fischinger on view at a gallery show that we had in San Francisco a few years ago. Some of these are published in my Fischinger book. You can see a few of them. And of course, Joe knows these well, Fischinger's notated scores. And if I did not mention, everything I'm showing is from the collection of Center for Visual Music, obviously, unless I say otherwise. We do have a number of other scores. This is an American March, 1941. We have a number of his animation artwork, including a number of materials related to the film radiodynamics. We have exhibited some of those. Museums tend to shy away and not really want to exhibit animation artwork, with a few exceptions. It's getting better these days. We have a great amount of materials, and we restored 5 films documenting Charles Dockham's mobile color projections. This is the state of the art of light projection back in 1942, silent light projections. And he built, I believe it was 5 different mobile color instruments during his lifetime. We have a short documentary that he made about his mobile color projectors, which we did restore. It is on one of our visual music DVDs. Here on the right side is one of his scores. On the left is still from a 1952 film. Vortex, we have a nice Belson collection. Well, we have Belson's films and original film materials, but also in terms of paper materials. Vortex concerts, Belson was the visual director. This was the first time experimental music and film had been used in a planetarium, to our knowledge. I've been working on a book for a number of years based upon interviews and conversations with Belson and a lot of research. Belson films, there are many, but here's just stills from a few. We restored the one on the right, Chakra, as well as a number of his other works. We have unfinished films and tests as well. And in our archive, we have lovely things like this, an evening of expanded cinema in Los Angeles, 1974. And I have to go a lot faster. I see that as the alarm. Sorry, let me cut this. In the Ward's collection, we also have a good amount of James Whitney material. Here's James at his home in Laurel Canyon. Glenn McKay Archive, Light Show Pioneer. Research. To steal from one is plagiarism. To steal from many is research. Those of you on Twitter may enjoy this shit academics say. What the biggest problem in visual music research to us is this, although I'd like to change this to data from 20 and 30 years ago. Why are academics continually publishing and republishing old data that's incorrect from 30 years ago? We don't understand. There's a lot of new data since then. There's a lot of new research. We don't understand why they're not doing that. This to us, other than the lack of fact checking, is a continual problem. Stop publishing old stuff. I mean, sounds simple. I mean, is it that hard? Fake news, 1946. Hans Richter revised the entire history of the German absolute film movement with an article in this US catalog for art and cinema, positioned himself as the first, said that Fischinger started way later, Ruteman and Egeling way later. He was the first. He was the first to make he also in a number of interviews, Richter also said he was the first to make an abstract film. He was the only one who published in English in America the history of that movement. And of course, he changed all the dates to his films and this, but that's another side. Fischinger's response, no, everything you said is wrong. This is one of the letters Fischinger to Richter in our collection. Some of that is on our website. I'm going to have to go much faster here and kind of skip some slides, I think. How do we address this problem of the old research? Well, obviously, by publishing as much as possible. Here's a Fischinger book, co-published with iFilm Museum in 2013. We did a symposium at which many of the presenters here presented, including Joe. Here we go. Here's the problem. People who think doing history is reading a few Wikipedia pages. We have a problem with Wikipedia. They continually take off factual data that we post. They continually take off links to original source documents from our archive. because it's not been published in a large publication that they acknowledge. Problem, Wikipedia, huge problem. Research barriers, funding, restrictions, funding. So we do keep a number of research sites. Some of them are more updated than the others for each of these filmmakers, and you can find this on our website, artist pages. Shout out to a few new books, especially this lovely 3-volume Len Lai new publication, upper right. Ellen Bute biography, very important, upper left. CVM projects coming up, projects giving access to visual music history. Of course, there's Fishinger's Raumlichkunst, restoration of his 1926 live cinema immersive performances, shown at major museums worldwide. Reconstruction from newly preserved 1920s nitrate originals. Raumlichkunst Black Box Gallery exhibitions, Sons et Lumières at the Pompidou, History of Sound in the Art of the 20th Century. We provided a huge amount of material for this, restored several films for this, including some Whitney and Harry Smith. Visual music, Blockbuster Show at MoCA. Many of you know the catalog. That was a 2-year project, or 2.5 years, providing research, consultation, restoring a number of films, providing most of the films. 90% of the films, I think, came from us. A program that we did at Los Angeles County Museum of Art, which included one of Maura's beautiful films. Entry to our Fishinger exhibition in 2012-13 Amsterdam. Here is the entry to it, co-organized by Center for Visual Music. As part of this, with Barbara Fishinger, we organized a performance of Fishinger's original Lumograph, his light play machine. I've been lucky to play it with her twice, once in Amsterdam and once in Frankfurt. Belson Films at Raven Royal Gallery, London, which I know some of you saw a few years ago. Radiodynamic paintings exhibited at the gallery in San Francisco. Sound Museum is now in Seoul till December 27, this exhibition. And upcoming projects in Tokyo, Melbourne, Centre Pompidou, and other places. Just a few ways we provide access to the history in the archive. And one thing I also want to say, please, 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 everybody, please credit everything. Please credit sources, please credit quotes, please credit photographs, always, 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 always. Thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Yes, that's really, really important. And something we should all remember. I'm going to move straight into questions from the chat, and I'm sure we've all got questions as well. But this seems like a good one to start with from Brian. I'm going to slightly truncate your question, Brian, if that's okay. Today, there's a justified growing wariness of new technology, especially machine learning and VR. Are there examples of visual music artists using new technology of their time to comment on the dangers of that technology? Chris, you've sort of answered that a bit on the chat, but do you want to just expand on that slightly?
Yeah, so I guess, I think for all tool makers who are producing video instruments is kind of medium critical, and a lot of them are very aware of the problems and affordances and opportunities of technology, and that both of those things are to do with how those technologies are leveraged in society and who controls them and all of those things. And often that's why you get filmmakers who maybe are producing their own tools rather than taking the tools of others. But you get in the 70s people like the Vasulkas who are making lots of very kind of like, I don't know, tool-based work that comes from their practice of developing tools and systems, but that I feel reflects this kind of understanding of like cybernetics, and they were bringing in lots and lots of kind of, and all the artists they were talking to, and the publication like Radical Software kind of foreshadows all of the things we're talking about now with AI and the semantic web and networking and being able to machine read everything, and then ingest that and search it and interrelate it and all of those things. And I think all of that kind of closed circuit video work, not just the kind of visual music stuff, is kind of dealing with those questions. But some of those things I think were, the themes are the same, but like they seem very much more scary and prescient now, because those things are now being realized, that were being talked about very early on then as these possibilities, these And I think they were sometimes misunderstood as utopian then, when actually what they were talking about was kind of the two paths that you can take, one that's utopian and one that's maybe not so much. Anyway.
Anyone else wants to chip in on that?
I would like to add something quite interesting about looking at the early 20th century's artists. They have this DIY spirit, which I often think is very related to what Levi Strauss said in Savage Mind about Bricoleur. So they will make kind of secondary functions. They come up with this very creative usage of something that was made by functionalists, but then we interpret it into something else and assemble them into something completely new. And then we were bold enough to even patent it. So that was quite interesting to look at the patents. When you actually look into it, they are quite speculative. They're not as rigid as it seems, and it gives you an idea about the artistic world. And maybe that what we are not doing right now is we're not as vocal or speculative because technology is becoming more and more complicated. So we invest our time into learning about these, and maybe that part of being speculative and provocative is a little bit lost, I suppose.
I'm going to chip in just quickly then. If just two thoughts that sprung to mind to me. One was John Whitney, who spoke quite a lot about swords into plowshares, about how a lot of his technology was wartime technology that he used to make art, and that was, I guess, a little bit utopian. And the other thought that sprung to mind is, I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this panel was a lot of the artists involved with Seeing Sound are using old technologies like oscilloscopes and so on. And I wonder if this is because those old technologies are a bit more transparent in some ways, or a bit more user-friendly. I'm sort of thinking about people who like old cars because they can like understand them and rebuild them, and in a way that you couldn't with a newer one.
Joe, I wanted to just add one thing about John Whitney. So he was amongst... You
know more about him than me, for sure.
Well, there was a couple of different artists. There's also a British artist who was using gun directors to make computer images, at the same time as John Whitney was working. But those gun director computers, which were used to control fire on ships, were all about building a model of the world, which you could then operate on, which is kind of what AI and VR, they were dealing with the same things and misusing them. And there are lots of art projects now in music and visual music that are starting to use AI. And I know Thor's just got a big project that is going to be kind of plugging into his research, who was speaking earlier at Seeing Sound. And I think that there's this kind of like, they were picking up lots of the stuff that was cheap and available after World War II. But all of those technologies that were really being developed in World War II for modeling things for warfare are also the technologies that then went on to found things like the World Wide Web and the internet that the web runs on, and all of those infrastructures, the same, all part of the same project. I don't know. That was my...
I just want to add to that as well. I'm just thinking of, is it Walter Ruttman? A different kind of danger, you could say, but he made the point that and it was probably something that's been said at the time, that we're kind of swamped with information, and we're so swamped with information that sometimes this kind of new kind of artist was emerging in this sort of swamped information area. And I'm just even thinking as well, and that was the point about, even for my own practice, I found that I was creating these new techniques, but they weren't really new techniques. They were actually avant-garde filmmaking techniques, but I wasn't aware of that. And there's an author called Lev Manovich who mentions that point, that that sometimes these new digital technologies are providing us with ways and means of accessing old techniques in an easier way, which is the opposite of perhaps the danger of the technology. There's an opportunity there that we have access to this incredible avant-garde technique with so easily nowadays. So it's just interesting, those balances between what is dangerous and what is an opportunity, I suppose, etc.
That's really interesting about Ruttman. I didn't know that. That seems like an incredibly contemporary idea, the sort of information overload.
Yes.
Yeah. Cindy, did you have anything you wanted to chip in on that?
No, I think they're covering it much better than I could.
Okay. Chris, you brought up cybernetics, and that always seems like a really interesting thing to talk about in these contexts. It seems like an idea that keeps kind of coming back. And you know, it seems again really relevant today, and to maybe link to some of these ideas around AI and so on. Do you think there is a lineage from cybernetics to AI, perhaps?
Totally, and I think that there's, although I would say I'm not an expert at all, it's something I've been reading a lot about recently and linking in with other things that I'm interested in around visual music, that a lot of the conversations of this over the Seeing Sound have been about embodiment and AI, and lots of kind of similar themes are coming up. And I think some of those themes are also come up in kind of performance and interactivity and interacting with musical instruments, and these kind of complex systems between performers, or between viewers and performers, or between an interactive experience and the person interacting with it, all kind of are described through cybernetics. And yeah, I guess there's this renewed interest because I think that we're suddenly having this super networked world with all of these things very apparent, but actually all of these kinds of separate projects and technologies reflect this wider thing that people are becoming much more aware of and literate in, because they have to be, because it's more part of their everyday lives. Even though it has been, as I said, been flagged from, you know, the emergence of these technologies and understood maybe even before then in deeper histories. I think there's this kind of excitement and fear, as people are saying, like this wariness of the newer technologies and some of the kind of like creative applications, and maybe ways for people to play and start to understand those things.
Yeah, great. Teresa Connors has fed in to the chat a suggestion for reading Andrew Pickering's Cybernetic Brain. I'm not sure I've read that, so I will. So do any of the panelists want, have you got anything else that you particularly burningly want to discuss or ask?
I had a bit of a think, because you asked us to come up with some provocations, and something that I think is really great about Seeing Sound, and something that we talked a lot about when doing Vector Hack, was who are we including, and recognizing when we're doing well and trying to be as diverse as possible in all sorts of different ways, but also who are we not including and how can we maybe include them. And with, I think Vector Hack is like a super case example where we have such a specific remit that we've boxed ourselves into, and which is what we really care about and are interested in. Then within that, trying to be as diverse as possible becomes quite challenging, and it becomes a question of, well, can you really examine what this framework you've set yourself is, and how can you find things that are like it and just outside of it, and then bring people in from there and relate them, which actually then really enriches what's going on. And I think Seeing Sound has such a diverse set of talks and performances when I attended, and this year, that it's like another good example of that, where there's this kind of tension between the two, and you've got to have some sort of framework and a strong theme, because that's how you communicate what you're about. And I think what you were saying, Joe, earlier about visual music and Lumia, as Trent was saying, are these kinds of things to kind of like frameworks to talk about, but that there's also a kind of tension there, because you want to be as diverse as possible, include as many people as possible. And sometimes that means you have to kind of like get creative, but also there's lots of proactive work of going out into other fields and finding people. So that was my thought.
And I suppose I just would like to contribute there as well. I think sometimes it's really good to encourage people to do the work, to create these works in whatever way they want to do it, because I have been teaching like myself for 20 years, and I'm very struck by maybe sometimes a lot of fear that might sometimes come to the field, as if maybe I shouldn't be doing this, or do you think this is right, or do you think I should? I think really it's that kind of, I feel myself my role as like a mentor, supporting people. Please go and do it. Please have a go. Find your own way. Find your own interests and have a go. Because if I try to put too much of my view of what it is on it, then I mean, you know, it's difficult. It's trying to get them to the confidence to say, look, I can do this in whatever way I might like to. But I think sometimes I'm inclined to bring them back to the history of visual music a little bit, to say, look at what was done before, look at the ideas people were suggesting, and the limited, you know, maybe resources that they had, but look what they came up with, or their approaches. So you have the opportunity now to do incredible things with this timeline you have, or whatever that you have access to. So I think it's this idea of encouraging people to do this work. You know, there's a sort of an important aspect of this, and to be really, maybe to be kind of pioneers in their own practice, and to go for it. And I suppose that's something I see has been really important, to just give that sort of encouragement and that kind of thing. I'm rambling a bit, I know, that I'm trying to do that in panels, but there you go.
No, Maura, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and something we could maybe talk about a bit here is sort of teaching and passing this stuff on to future generations. And I actually really liked what you said there about maybe directing people towards history to see what people could do with such limited means. Yeah. Something that came to mind for me, Cindy, and one of the reasons I like Fishinger so much is that in parts of his career, not all of them, he worked with incredible limitations, like some of the studies that are all hand drawn on, as I know from the CVM archive, pieces of paper that are that big. And I often say that to my students, you know, Fishinger could do this with some pencils and some paper. You've got like all this software and
right. Well, many of the early pioneers, they had no choice. Fishinger couldn't go online and order the latest software, obviously. He couldn't even go down to a shop and buy animation equipment. There wasn't any. They were forced to create their own tools. And that happened time and time again. Even down to Jordan Belson creating his mysterious optical bench with all the mysterious apparatus. And partly he had no money to go out and buy something. So many, John Whitney, obviously, and definitely Fishinger, over and over, creating inventions to realize his visions with just a few tools. And granted, he did have a degree as an engineer. But the wax slicing machine, the synthetic sound machine, throughout his whole life. And then later, there was a various stereo apparatus. And by the way, while I'm talking, I do want to give a clarification and a caveat to an earlier statement I made about don't publishing old sources. What I meant to say was don't publish the old sources that are full of errors. And of course, there's some older sources that do stand the test of time. There's not a lot in visual music that aren't full of errors. I just meant be careful about errors that have been republished time and time again from older sources.
I'm going to feed questions in. Sorry, who was someone saying something? Was it you, Trent? Go ahead.
That was me, but I will say something. In terms of historical reading, what I have discovered from the archive was the reading Thomas Wilfred journal articles weren't really helpful because he was trying to prove himself to be wherever he was publishing it. So we need to be able to distinguish the historical artifacts. But then when you look at his patents, where he needs to be very transparent about what this is for, but also his diagrams of designs and personal sketches or his lecture transcript are very encouraging in terms of maker's perspective. It's because he wants people to take up Lumia and then actually make it, whereas historians, they're often too critical. They try to situate it and often apologetic, saying Lumia is fantastic, Thomas Wilfred is great, but what he's claiming isn't really true, but you can fit it here, maybe over there. So that kind of nuance has to be unpacked, I think. That's one of our jobs, probably as makers and historians. We can distinguish them and then present a more positive discourse of the histories.
Yeah, that's something you touched on, Cindy, wasn't it? Of like artists sort of rewriting their own history, and I suppose that's a really interesting point that artists, maybe by their nature, are propagandists. They have to big up their own work, or maybe they don't have to.
Right. Yeah, I think a rule of thumb in film archives is never trust the artist's own filmography. Those dates they're a little dicey sometimes, but often they're done decades later towards the end of their lives. But I think Richter is the most extreme case, however, of an artist rewriting history that we're aware of. But there have been, there's been a number of things in the past, and there's things published in major museum exhibition catalogs, statements by artists or data from artists that is false. We do keep a research errata site online where we do post the most major factual errors that we do see. We do put that online. We see an awful lot of drafts of books, journals, articles, master's theses, dissertations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because a lot of people are asking for material from the archive, photographs, original documents, et cetera. So in many cases, we ask, to see a draft when we can. We also do provide fact checking to some of them, like our members, for example. Anyway, in all the drafts that we see, especially exhibition catalogs, books, book chapters, journals, 95% of them are full of factual errors, just as an aside. So one thing, I know I'm wandering here a bit, but one thing I do lament in the history of visual music is what happened to fact checking? Where did that go?
Yeah, fair. Possibly slightly related, I don't know if it is, but it goes back to one of our previous discussions. And I generally want to feed a few things in from the chat. Derek Holzer has asked a question about young artists who haven't looked into the history arrive on their own at the same place, but feel they've invented it themselves. And he's pointed out that this happens with video feedback and 5-year cycles. And that was a discussion recently on video circuits, wasn't it, Chris? Alberto Novello, who was very aware that he was reinventing it, but yeah, that happens. And I mean, I suppose my question to the panel is that altogether bad? I mean, it is in some ways, but sometimes I see a certain naivety in my students, and I almost envy them thinking that they've discovered video feedback, because I don't know, it can actually open up creativity in some ways, that naivety.
Yeah, I actually think there's an opportunity in it by coming to something yourself through your own, whatever, through your own discoveries. I'm even just thinking of my own experience. I had 2 years of not knowing a history, not knowing anything about it, and they were the nicest 2 years of my life. Not saying there's anything wrong with history, but I really did quite enjoy just kind of going around like, oh wow, I haven't seen this before. I didn't know people do this. And I when you go and then look at it, it is quite nice to discover it then. I mean, I do feel at some point you do have to kind of acknowledge what has gone before is important, but it is interesting that there is that freedom that comes with maybe not having, maybe a priori knowledge, knowing what it should or shouldn't be. So there is perhaps some opportunities, but yeah, perhaps it also, if Derek's saying that students are coming to it and think, I've just done this, it is nice to kind of maybe just gently remind them, perhaps to look at the history, there you go, there's the book.
Yeah, the other thing in there is, it's all right to be naive, but you can't carry on being naive for 30 years,
No, 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah, that's the most you can get away with.
We had an artist, sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
No, Cindy, please.
We had an artist email us, slightly peeved, that we had used a still from his film on our website without credit. And I'm like, excuse me, that's from Jordan Belson in the 1960s. And his current work was exactly the same as that still. No.
Yeah.
Chris.
I guess the thing I wanted to add, and I think Moira, maybe there's really, because you also share so much work online from other people, and I spend my time answering people's questions and telling them to search stuff and directing them to older artists who might be doing something similar to them. I do find that sometimes, and I react like this myself, I'm like, oh, well, that makes me want to engage with this less. But there's something else that I think a lot of great projects come from individual exploration. And just because someone has done something once doesn't mean that you doing it yourself in an inefficient way. And I'm also incredibly pragmatic. I will take schematics and data sheets and other people's ideas and produce something myself and go and find the ways in which people have done things to achieve my aims. But I'll never try to necessarily replicate what they've done. But I might take a shortcut that way. And I think there's also benefits in the people who say, no, I want to do this completely from scratch. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding about where people get demotivated when actually they should be really motivated that they've put all this time in, because I think you get a different kind of understanding through materially engaging with something like it and making things than you do from researching, and the two can work amazingly well together. But there's this kind of like, well, hey, you should be aware of all of these things, but you shouldn't necessarily let that stop you from redoing this process or working in that way, because newness isn't the most important thing. I think it's this like engagement with material and playing, and whether that's playing music or visual music, and this kind of like, yeah, I don't know how to describe this kind of balance between the two, but I hate giving people that feeling where I'm like, here's 17 different artists who've already done this thing, and a massive long thread about all of the different interesting things you can research. And sometimes they're like, oh, but I thought I did this. But it's then giving them a bit of time and encouraging them, and then maybe that completely changes what they were doing, but in a good way. But as long as they hang on to the bits that they made themselves, because I think that's really, yeah, valuable. And I like to.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, Chris. I think I'm very conscious as well. Like I use the same method all the time, and you know, it's just this method of using color in the same way, and I can't seem to get out of it. I'm just stuck there. But I'm noticing that that you know, students, you know, they like to kind of create new things, and it's good to encourage them to do so. And it's that idea of not being afraid to look at other contents as well, but just kind of keep that sense of your own self, because I think that history is kind of always kind of evolving that way, and we kind of learn from each other, and we get insights, and we can move forward, and you know, and all that kind of thing. So it's kind of it's very easy to get demotivated. I totally get what you're saying there. And I suppose it's nice to kind of keep the motivation up and allow people to be, you know, pioneers in their own world at first, and then maybe move into looking at it in a more detail later, if that's the way it works for them.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel you can come out the other side. I guess this discussion with Alberto on the video circuits was a good example of that he totally knew that he's retreading old ground. And I'm reminded of Robert Henke yesterday in his project with 40-year-old computers, and he specifically said that he was interested in how his mind 40 years later works with these technologies in a completely different way than people would have done at the time. It's kind of interesting. I just aware there's a few more things back on the chat. Sophie asked this question, which is perhaps to you particularly, Maura. Are we the embodied carriers of the past, which manifests in our present being? And she's referring to something you said about history as a living present. And I wondered if you could discuss that further.
Oh yeah, sure. I suppose it was probably a provocative statement in a way, but I suppose it came out of my own, having spent the last few years doing my research in my PhD. I felt that I wasn't initially going to look at history, but I was going to look at other things, but somehow or other I couldn't look at the other things unless I kind of looked at the history. So to a certain extent, I came to that conclusion that somehow or other history is this flowing from the past into our present, and constantly revisiting and checking and revisiting and going back for the insights. And so it's that idea that perhaps it's not to forget, or you know, to bring our our memories and our knowledge and mind into the whole factor, to point to things in history, I suppose. And everyone's going to point at different things, and I suppose and you're going to point at things that are of interest to you in your present moment. And I suppose when I was doing my research for my PhD, I was particularly looking at my own arts practice. It was just providing a context for my own practice was what the PhD was about. But I was very much interested in pointing to these masters and the insights that they could bring us. And somehow or other, they were dealing with the same things. It was so fascinating. So it's like, for example, in the area of form, the idea, I have a way of working with form, but I can't articulate it. I find it extremely hard to say to someone, try and make this instrument. I can't, because it's so complex, but it's not really, it's just I'm just doing it so fast. But when I came across a writing by Len Lai, that he did, co-wrote, I can't remember the co-author, but he wrote an article that movement creates form, and that's what he was trying to get at. And I went, that's exactly what I was trying. It's the movement, it's all these movements coming together and the form emerges. And so to a certain extent, it was my bodily resonance with that, where I thought that's living in me. I'm trying to do that too. So, and other people are probably trying to do it. And it kind of made sense that sometimes the form isn't there a priori, but it kind of comes through the processes. And it comes through my embodied, my visceral experience of what I'm looking for and searching for. When I put together all my motion elements, which I would have maybe 50, 60 of them come together all at once. So it's like that idea, movement creates form. So Sorry, I have rambled a bit again. There you go.
No, not at all.
Yeah, good question. Very good question.
Yeah, good question and good answer, I thought. I'm sort of conscious we need to stop quite soon. We're not there. We've got 10 minutes, but just to sort of start thinking about the end. Do any of the panelists have anything they particularly burningly want to bring up that we haven't yet?
I just want to follow up Maura's provocation. And in fact, it's about the importance of autoethnographic aspect of our practice. So in a sense, what I have done with Lumia, what was helpful was trying to reenact a certain experiment and trying to relive some of the concepts and those kind of fictional setups that I've read or encountered in historical artifacts really helped me to embody and also own the subject matter, which didn't really happen if I wanted to see that in the distance and trying to find a kind of modern translation from that very first point. So in a sense, going back to even previous question about working with students, if they encounter that process of reiteration of the history, then I think they are very fortunate, because when they actually look back, they will have seen something that they're very personal as well as historical, because there's never the duplication of the same thing, and because the projects are different. And I often found looking back the old projects, which I had no idea what I was doing, but now things are making sense in years later. So there's quite good importance of emphasizing autoethnographic presence within historical reading and writing.
Yes, absolutely. That's really, really interesting stuff, and seems very seeing sound somehow, that, you know, there's a real kind of link between us and people and this history. And it actually reminds me of something you said, Chris, earlier, which I meant to pick up on really, with video circuits, is, you know, our history is not necessarily dead. You know, many of our historical antecedents are still around, and they may have stopped doing what they did, but they're still there if you want to kind of find them. Yeah. I just one thing I thought might be good to sort of feed in to finish without really discussing it is, there's been a little bit of discussion on the chat about publication, the journal, and that we need one for visual music. And a couple of answers. There's an edition of Organized Sound on audiovisual composition that I would really recommend. And Chris also mentioned Leonardo, which is probably the first place I would look for this kind of thing. But I just wanted to say, and just put it out there, that I'm up for that. I wouldn't do it on my own, but if anyone, you know, growing out of, you know, our discussions and our networks and so on, wants to try and make something like that happen, I think it would be really good and a really worthwhile thing. And some of the people on these panels, this panel in particular, would be the key people.
Super idea.
Make that happen.
I think the Center for Visual Music would like to talk to anyone who'd like to seriously do it, if it was not through some standard academic channels that require huge lengths of time and that require contributors to purchase their own copies and that have an exorbitant fee. It would need to be accessible at very affordable fees, shall we say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is not the case with many of the places it's being published. And one little last plug for those that don't read any bios, I have a history of the Vortex concerts coming out in the next journal, After All journal, in the next edition, early 2021.
Fabulous.
That's fantastic, Cindy. I mean, if any of you don't know about the Vortex concerts, it's one of the most amazing sort of chapters of visual music history, and Cindy is the expert on that. So
as well as music, as well as music and concerts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, there's plenty of unanswered questions on the chat, and I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to sort of draw things to a close a bit, mainly because I just want to say a few closing statements, if that's okay, and we do need to stop on time. Primarily, I just want to thank everybody. This has not been the same as usual, let's be honest. But it's still been great. It's still been the best we could possibly do, I think, under these circumstances. And I really appreciate everyone getting involved and participating and interacting and making it happen. I always say this, and I guess everybody says this at the end of most conferences, but, you know, I couldn't do it without you. It's everybody who's here, whether on the panel or in the chat or in any form is this event. It is the people. But there are a few kind of key people that I really want to thank, and I won't list everybody because it would be too long. But I really want to thank all the people that contributed pieces and papers. I thought it was a really fantastic program this year. I've still got plenty left to watch, even though I tried to stay up all night. I particularly want to thank the panelists. I think these panels have been really, really interesting, actually. They really, I'm going to watch them all again, I have to say. And I would love to name all the panelists in a list, but I think it's too long a list at this stage. But you all deserve it to be named. I do want to thank the chairs, actually, because it's a big job, that, and I really appreciate the people that have helped me with it. So Margaret Ann Shadell, Sylvia Lane, Martin Duprat and Jan Meinemer, thanks so much for doing that. And then there's a few kind of behind the scenes people I really want to thank. Actually, particularly the people involved in our overnight program. That was a bit of a last minute idea and a slightly crazy idea, but one of the most enjoyable things for me was being able to bring on a few kind of co-curators to put work on. So Jean Pichet and Myriam Boucher from Montreal. Do check out all these programs if you missed them overnight. They were amazing. Sean Pinchbeck and Beams for the Dueling Axes live program. Bridget Burke and Mark Peterson for the program, the Scene Sound program from Melbourne. And both Max Hattler and Rio Ikishiro for the programs from Hong Kong. And yeah, again, if you didn't catch those this morning, I actually literally woke up this morning and watched them straight out of bed, and they were amazing. And then, yeah, some people really behind the scenes who've been on all of these chats but not appearing. I need to thank my colleague Paul Jebanassam, who's actually been at least as big a part of Seeing Sound this year as I have. I don't know why he hasn't been putting himself in chairs and things, but he's been there all the time and really a key part of this event. Erin Maguire, who's been producing the event and making all of this happen seamlessly. I have to say, I absolutely could not have done that job myself. If I'd been in charge of all these streams and YouTube things, they would have just been an absolute shambles, and they've been anything but, I have to say. So Erin, thanks so much for that. I hope you're there. I'm sure you are. And finally, Thierry Vaudor, who built the website for us that had to actually be completely rebuilt from scratch this year. So it was a huge job. But yeah, thank you, everybody. I really hope that I will see you again in real life for something like this, or something that one of you put on in the future. I really love this visual music world. It's a great community. And let's keep meeting however we can. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to close it out.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.